I think we are live. Here we go. Good on YouTube, Facebook. Waiting on you guys. All right, sweet. There we go. Looks like you can hear me. Let's move these in a little bit just that way I can be a little bit louder. Hope you all are having a happy Monday. I think today is April 13th. I'm not really good with dates anymore. I just know today's Monday because yesterday was Sunday, Easter Sunday. Hope you all had a wonderful Easter Sunday. If you're in Georgia, Alabama, any parts of the Southeast, I hope, hopefully you're not too impacted by the storms that came through the state last night. They were pretty intense, especially later on in the evening as the evening went. So we'll just give everyone a little bit of time. Let me send out a tweet. All right, so we're good there. There we go. Hey, Stephen in Omaha, welcome. So, let's see, location. Give everyone a little bit of time. All right, cool. Looks like we are live on both Facebook and YouTube. So why don't we get started? I think if you're a Georgia fan, the biggest thing you saw this weekend, YouTube commenters, the biggest thing you saw this weekend was from an ESPN list that came out last July, and it essentially ranked the fans care about it is because Georgia was not on there at all. Georgia was left off the list, and in the original article published back in July, it cited the lack of star production in the early 2000s, and it also sort of elaborated on, it placed greater emphasis on producing All-Americans. And between Noshawn Marino, Todd Gurley, Sony Michel, Nick Chubb, and DeAndre Swift, those five running backs, all very talented, very, very good players, have a combined one All-American appearance. So I think the metrics that were used were sort of stacked against the Georgia running backs. But I think if you talk to the people that matter, especially the recruits, running back recruits, they know if you go to Georgia, they're going to feature you. They're not going to put too much wear and tear on your tires, and they're going to get you into the NFL. We saw Todd Gurley, even though he had a torn ACL, he still went 10th overall. Sony Michel was never the feature back at Georgia. I believe it was 31st to the Patriots. Nick Chubb had a horrific knee injury his time in college. He was still able to go 35th to the Browns in that 2018 draft. And then this year, DeAndre Swift, I think he should be the first running back taken. I don't necessarily know if he's going to be. I don't know if he's going to be a first rounder. I certainly think he should. I think the Chiefs at 32 should sprint to the podium if he's still there, because I think him in that offense, especially just his pass catching abilities, I think would bring a lot to them. But in sort of the tease, and it's on the Facebook team, Travis McCullough, Edward Morrow. We've got a few more people coming in here talking about Georgia's sort of RBU running back ranking. And the story I wrote this morning about it for DawgNation, I compared it to the film Goodfellas. Goodfellas is a movie directed by Martin Scorsese, for those that don't know. It's a widely popular film, widely viewed film. It's not exactly for everyone. There are a lot of curse words in there. It is sort of your classic gangster film. In some people's minds, it's the most iconic and best gangster film that has sort of ever been made, starring Robert De Niro, Joe Pesci, who won the only Oscar for the movie, Ray Liotta. Just a phenomenal movie. It's not my personal favorite, as a friend of the program, Dylan Thompson, and I have gone back and forth on quite a bit. I'm not a huge Scorsese fan. I think his movie's a little too long. Hey, what's up, Bill Kibbe? But at the night, I think in today's day and age, just about everyone recognizes the greatness of the film Goodfellas. But back at the 1991 Oscars, it did not win Best Picture. It did not win Best Adapted Screenplay, and it did not win Best Director, even though, now everyone sort of regards it as Scorsese's masterpiece, and Scorsese is one of the best filmmakers of the past century. And Dances with Wolves is the movie that won both Best Picture, Best Adapted Screenplay, and Best Director, which went to Kevin Costner. I don't know how much I don't think people are talking a whole lot about Dances with Wolves in today's modern day culture. Hey, Joe Moody, welcome in. It's certainly a very good, certainly very well done movie, but the movie that came out, the movie that still resonates with people from that time is Goodfellas. It's a movie that you can watch it now when it's on Netflix. people that take notice of it and they watch it and they, throw some tweets out there about that. And it's sort of the people's champion from that 1991 Oscars. And I think Georgia in the running back position are still very much viewed as the same way. Georgia, because of the cachet that it has with running backs, it's sort of able to get in with just about any elite running back that it wants. Obviously, it's not going to win all those. You've already seen in this 2021 class, Ohio State has scooped up two of Georgia's top targets, Evan Pryor and TreVeyon Henderson. But Georgia, just about every year, is going to be in the running to probably land an elite running back. And they're still able to do that in this 2021 cycle. You saw last week, they landed four-star running back Lavassier Carroll, originally from Georgia. He plays at IMG Academy. And Georgia's still probably going to bring in another really talented running back, whether that be Donovan Edwards out of Michigan. I believe he's the number 3 running back in the 2021 class. Or, another local product, Cody Brown, who plays and stars for Parkview High School, who put up monster numbers last year at the highest level of the Georgia classification. I think those two are two certainly names to keep an eye on. Hey, guys. Hey, Facebook. Chris Milton, good to see you. I know we're going to get to G-Day a little bit later. I think what we would have seen there, it's certainly a bummer. It's certainly been a very weird past month, with just not being able to see spring practice. I think it's a really important time for a lot of players. You saw this time last year. Azeez Ojulari was a name not a whole lot of people were really focusing on, knew much about. We were still talking about Brenton Cox, Adam Anderson, even, newcomers like Nolan Smith and Jermaine Johnson. And those guys, didn't have as good springs as Azeez Ojulari did. Ojulari came out, was fantastic, much like he was in the bowl practices in December. And it really set him up to be, Georgia's best pass rusher come this fall. And I think you were seeing something similar at a couple other positions. But before we get too far into that, let's just sort of wrap up the running back talk and where they're going from here. Georgia's going to put another elite running back into the NFL next week, probably even 2 with Brian Herrien. I don't know where he's going to get drafted. Late 7th round pick, probably an undrafted guy. But sometimes being an undrafted free agent is actually better than being a 7th round draft pick, because you do actually have some agency in where you get to go, and sort of the depth chart might be more favorable there. But, Swift is going to go there. And then you look at the current lineup, Zamir White, I think is at the bare minimum, his floor, he's going to be a good, capable running back. I don't know if he's ever going to be the player that we all thought and hoped he would be pre-2 ACL injuries, but his floor, I think, is incredibly high, just given the natural talent that he has and sort of the way he sort of has attacked rebuilding his body and rebuilding his game. I was very impressed last year where, especially in that Sugar Bowl against Baylor, he showed he was a very physical runner, and that's not necessarily something you would expect a guy initiating contact coming off 2 ACL injuries. I think behind him, James Cook is someone who this spring I would have been very interested to see how he sort of develops in the Todd Monken offense. We've talked about and written about him before, about what we could have seen from him. I think in a more, for whatever reason, he just never really fit in the James Coley offense. And I would have been excited to see what Monken could have been able to get out of Cook. And you got guys like Kenny McIntosh and Kendall Milton who, to sort of pivot into what we're going to talk about next year. I think those guys would have been the stars of G-Day. Traditionally it's not a big passing, numbers day. Jacob Eason, Jake Fromm, Justin Fields, they never put up, monster numbers in those spring games. But you've seen from time to time that running backs can have very good and very productive days. And I think McIntosh and Milton, I think certainly would have done so. McIntosh in 2019, it's a guy who I think when he signed and committed to the program, not everyone was super thrilled or happy that was the only running back Georgia brought in. In that 2019 class, they did have John Emery Jr. committed for a while there, but he ultimately ends up signing with LSU. Just trying to keep. We're going to get to Dajon Edwards. He's a guy from Colquitt County, as Todd Merrick brings up, who, Colquitt County, the past decade, best high school program in Georgia, certainly on a year in, year out basis. And Edwards is as good as any player to come out of there in recent years. He's a guy who, unfortunately, he's not. No one was able to go through spring practice, obviously, but he was a guy who who was set to be a summer enrollee. And I don't know how much we have seen out of him this first year. I think a year from now is really when you'll expect to hear and know a little bit more about what Georgia has in Edwards. But back to McIntosh, his commitment was not met with the same sort of fanfare that we've traditionally seen from other running backs. And when he got on the field, though, in his past season, he showed flashes that, he's a capable player and a good running back. He had the longest run of the season for Georgia of 61 yards, I believe, against Murray State. Now, obviously, he didn't play in a whole lot of big games, and I don't even think necessarily he was expected to be a big part of the running back rotation in the Sugar Bowl. And the only reason he saw quite a few more carries there was because James Cook went down with an injury in that game. But he's a guy who you think might have maybe a little bit more wiggle than Zamir White does, just given, what he is now. So I think it would have been really interesting because I think that would have been a day in a game where he is really featured and we really get to see, the fan base does anyway, a lot from a player who has at least intrigued a lot of people with what he's done on a small sample size to this point. Isn't enough to overtake Zeus as the number one running back, who I do think is going to be the number one guy? Probably not, but I do think it could have allowed him to showcase that he can be a very good complement. And then the other player we brought up was Kendall Milton. I thought he was going to be the most impressive early enrollee. Georgia had 6 of them, along with Jamie Newman, the quarterback, who I guess we can talk about here as well. If you guys have any comments or questions, feel free to ask them now. We got a decent-sized audience on both Facebook and YouTube, and so far the technology looks like it's holding up pretty well. So Kendall Milton, I've been pretty frank. I've been on high him as any early enrollee that Georgia has this year. Obviously, he's the highest rated. And quite frankly, his rating would have been a little bit higher, but he did not go to an All-American game and somehow that decided to drop his stock down. You saw something similar happen with Jermaine Burton, who did not go to the Under Armour All-American game and thus plummeted from a top 50 prospect to the number 81 overall prospect. I don't know how much a meaningless January scrimmage has to necessarily do with prospect rankings, but Milton is a guy I am as high on as anyone in this class. Getting to spend some time with him and his family out in California. He's just a very mature kid, and it's something very rare that you don't see a whole lot in this day and age. And from my understanding of it, he was a true behind-the-scenes leader, along with Mikhail Sherman, and sort of putting together Georgia's number one recruiting class in the country. And Milton is a guy who he's just so already as a even then when I saw him back in July with Justin Tell when we went out there to do his commitment video, he's just already so physically impressive. And then you put him in the Georgia weight training program, and he's somehow even bigger. And I can guarantee you he's not losing a step of speed just because he's reshaping his body a little bit. And I think it would have been really interesting to see, one, just how he performs in sort of a really big stage in the Georgia uniform, but two, sort of how Monken uses him, because he was not necessarily used as a pass catcher a whole lot coming out of high school, but it is something he showed flashes of being able to do and make moves in the open field. I think year one, my personal expectations for him, there's a lot of overlap between what White might be able to give Georgia this year and what Milton is able to give Georgia. But, I think a year from now, while this year we're probably going to be talking a lot about Zamir and James Cook, I think a year from now, assuming both those guys do go pro, and Georgia is sort of operating on the assumption by going out and trying to recruit true running backs that this is probably going to be maybe it for White and Cook, especially. And if things go well, that's great. It's not always about who you're losing. It's about who you guys are bringing in. Matt Rugvina, good to see you. Welcome in. Charles Felder, good to see you in as well. I think with Milton and McIntosh, a year from now, we're talking like that. We're talking about them the way, we probably talked about Nick and Sony back in 2015, going into that 2015 season. Obviously, things did not end that well that year, but I think from a youth standpoint and sort of what the future of that position could be, I still think running back is a very good spot. I guess now we've gone about 14 minutes here. I think it's time to address Jamie Newman. We'll take some of your comments, questions you guys want to talk about, anything. Steven in Omaha is asking me. I do think there's going to be college football. At what capacity, I don't know. But like you're sort of saying, Steven, there's just too much money tied up, both at the NFL and the college level, to where, if they don't do this, it is, catastrophic. And so I do think we are going to see college football fan participation. I'm not smart enough to know what that might look like. I'm just going to rely on the experts and sort of take it from there. But let's dive into Jamie Newman. He obviously would have been the biggest talking point from G-Day. As I sort of alluded to earlier, I think I don't know that we would have seen necessarily, the statistical game that I think a lot of people would have wanted to see. He's not going to go 20 for 20 for 400 yards and 4 touchdowns. That's not how spring games work. And it's not really, Kirby Smart with Jake Fromm, when Jacob Eason was a starter, when Jake Fromm was that starter, when Fields came in, he made things intentionally tougher for Eason and Fromm as starters than they perhaps necessarily should have been when you're looking for sort of, easy games, easy narratives, oh, this guy looked really good. Kirby Smart treats that spring scrimmage while there's a lot of, hoopla, and it's a day generally you want to be positive about the program. He treats that like it is as a practice. Now, Zach Smith, I saw he asked sort of how deep are our guys getting into the new offense and whatnot. Kirby Smart has said that they were able to do some 7-on-7 work, in the offseason. Obviously, coaches weren't too involved with that. But, it's a minimal kind of thing where, yes, they have worked together, but obviously, and Smart has said this, you can't replicate the reps that in the live rounds you be getting during practice. And so, that's why he said quarterback and Newman in particular is probably the player most affected by this loss of spring practice. I do think that, they've mentioned, learning the playbook, the plays. As far as that, they get 4 hours mandatory of Zooming with coaches, and Zooming, and for those that don't know, it's sort of teleconferencing, talking with players and coaches and teams meetings and whatnot. And if they have any questions, they can go in there and do that. So, as far as a knowledge-based, aspect, I don't think that it's, that much of a hindrance, but I just, as Smart said, there's just nothing that can replicate. It's one of those things, you don't know what works or what doesn't until you get in there and do it. And that, I think, is what's going to, make things a little bit difficult for Newman, especially to start the season, whenever that may be. I'm personally a little optimistic that I do think September 7th, Monday night, we do see Georgia playing Virginia in Mercedes-Benz Stadium. How many fans are there? I'm not sure yet, but I do think, Jamie Newman will be the starting quarterback that day. We'll see him take the field. We will probably see Georgia win that day because, as much as we've talked about Georgia, Virginia's having to break in a whole new quarterback. Bryce Perkins is arguably one of the best players that program has put out in the 21st century. And he's off to, he's graduated, he's moved on. I think, that's going to be a tough challenge, especially for a Georgia defense that's going to be very good. Hitting on the defensive side of the ball for spring practice, I think Lucine is probably the guy who, if you want to, loser, the guy that misses out the most, is probably the guy who, is sort of that Jamie Newman of the defensive side of the ball. He was a guy who did get reps and starting reps in that run up to the Sugar Bowl, and actually played a big role in that LSU game and looked very impressive. Very impressive in those settings. But he was a guy who seemed anyway fully poised to take over for JRE in that safety role. And safeties are so important in sort of the way this Georgia defense is played under Kirby Smart because, they're not, this Georgia defense, they are not under Smart. They've not been an attacking defense. They do not force a ton of turnovers. They do not force a lot of tackles for loss, sacks, sort of negative plays on the defensive side of the ball. But what they've done so well is they limit big plays, and the safeties are the guys most responsible for that. And J.R. Reed, who is a guy who I think is going to, if he lands in the right situation, if he lands in, like, say, New England Patriots, or he goes to, I think a smart defensive-oriented team, I can be a very good player and a very useful player at the next level. J.R. Reed was so important to what this Georgia defense did, and replacing that is not necessarily easy. Now, obviously, I have a lot of faith in Richard LeCount. Jeff Sentell in our DawgNation mock draft the other day took him number 1 overall. I don't think that's, some people would prefer Pickens, but I think, sort of the backyard football kind of thing you want. I don't have a problem with Richard LeCount going first. LeCount, I think, is a better leader than Pickens. And, it's not necessarily fair to Pickens because he's only a sophomore, but I do think there are some off-the-field things that Richie brings that George right now just necessarily doesn't. But, back to Scene, I do think, him getting those similar live reps, I do think it's going to be interesting and sort of seeing when that gets implemented. If I had to guess, assuming we get an all clear and players are allowed to return back to campus, I do think we're going to see some extra July practices than perhaps we traditionally do, because I believe you were only allowed, a certain amount of practices 30 days out. So I think to make up for spring practices, which so many teams across the country, Alabama, Ohio State, all Georgia had just completely wiped away, I do think we're going to see a few more of those. So, defensively, I still think Georgia's going to be relatively fine. I think compared to some of the other teams that have to install new things or are sort of looking for bigger leaps from players, Georgia's going to be very well off. I think, they're probably still going to have the best defense in the country, in my opinion. It might not show up in sacks and turnovers and forced fumbles, but as far as driving the length of the field and putting points on the board, I just don't know if there's a better defense in the country than Georgia's. I think that was the case last year. You can bring up the LSU game where Joe Burrow diced them. Joe Burrow diced up everybody. Joe Burrow was incredible last year. There was a debate going of who's the best, college football player ever, Cam or Joe Burrow. I think that's sort of the debate that emerged. Statistically, it's just not close between Burrow and Cam now as far as what they meant to each team. I think that's certainly much more up for debate. And if you want to side with Cam there, I'd probably maybe be inclined to agree with you. But again, this Georgia defense, I think they're going to be fine. I think if there are any questions, it's about the offensive side of the ball. And you look at some of the other big teams that Georgia has to play. Auburn's installing a new system, though. How much Gus Malzahn really lets Chad Morris cook there, I don't know. Alabama, they're having some turnover there with Tua, and they have to replace Jerry Jeudy and Devontae Smith. So we'll see what happens there. But, those big teams that Georgia's competing against, I think they're going to be fine. Florida, ironically, they're replacing a lot of their top production at the wide receiver position. I believe 4 of their top 6 pass catchers from this past season. As Georgia showed last year, it's not necessarily a given that wide receivers and pass production is easy to replace, especially even if you have a quarterback. I think just about everyone agrees. Jake Fromm is better than Kyle Trask, but is Trask going to be that good enough to where he's able to make up for the wide receiver production and pass catching production that Florida lost? I don't think so, and it'll be really interesting to see, I think, what Mullen is able to get out of that Florida offense next year. So, comparing Georgia to the rest of the teams in the country, I think they're all, I don't think Georgia is significantly worse off because of this, or now they're significantly more disadvantaged than they would have been had this all not happened. Herman Wilmot, good to see you, Herman. Welcome in. News on tight ends. Yeah, tight end's an interesting position because I don't think we would have seen a whole lot from them this spring. I think Trey McKitty is the guy in the 2020 season. And then from there, we'll be interested to see how Denzel Washington develops. I know Mike Griffith is really high on him. Personally, after seeing Washington down in Orlando for the Under Armour All-American game. And again, these All-American games, I get what they're doing, but it's hard to really take and learn a lot from these environments just because, sometimes guys, once their high school season ends, they're just kind of, switching it off and sort of moving on from there. So I don't really know how much to take away from that. But, Washington is the future. I think John Fitzpatrick is a guy who's probably, you're going to hear his name called a lot this spring, and he's probably going to be pretty involved in the offense, at least from a blocking standpoint, come this fall. I don't really know what to expect from the tight end usage. We saw it fluctuate with Monk in his time both in Tampa and as the offensive coordinator, they're not play caller in Cleveland. So Charles Felder asks, outlook on the receiving core this season. To start the season, it's going to be a lot. I think it's going to be a lot of George Pickens, like more so than it probably should be. Just given, Dominic Blaylock's still going to be working his way back from a knee injury, and everyone here knows I'm as high on Blaylock as anybody. But, knee injuries, especially with a guy who athleticism was not his game anyway, and losing, him losing half a step, well, I think he can still make it up, and he's still a good enough football player to do everything else well. I don't, early in the season, I wouldn't expect, I'd be surprised if he had 100 yards and 2 touchdowns against Alabama. But I think, those later in the season games, Alabama, Florida, Tennessee, I do think he should be ready to go by that point in time. And all indications are in his recovery, he is still progressing as well as he can. You would not have seen him a whole lot this spring, but that was always going to be the case given his knee injury happened in the first week in December. And furthering that, and the reason I think why Pickens is going to be so involved and so crucial early on, and Georgia needs him to play like the player I think everyone thinks that he can be, Arian Smith, Justin Robinson, Marcus Rosemead, Jermaine Burton. These are all newcomers, Ladd McConkey, all newcomers to the Georgia offense. But these are guys who, again, they will have not gone through the reps. They will be, relatively new. And even as we saw this past season, Pickens, it took him against the second half against LSU and then in the Sugar Bowl against Baylor. That's just not necessarily a fair expectation. So I think Georgia, early on, it is going to be the Georgia wide receiver core will only be as good as George Pickens is. Now, over the course of the season, I think this is a unit that's going to get better, and by the end of the year, and certainly going into next season, I don't think there are going to be a whole lot more questions about this wide receiver core. I think, we're going to see something at some point. I think Kyrus Jackson and Demetrius Robertson, guys who some of us have been waiting on or looking to see a little bit more. Brody Miser mentions Tommy Bush. I should also mention Matt Landers here since we've mentioned Tommy Bush. I think a couple of guys, those guys are going to have a moment. Bush is a guy who, his season last year, he mostly got wiped out because of injury. And I think him not getting a chance to sort of showcase this spring and show what he could be before some of those newcomers get here. I do think is a little bit of a bummer for him, but he's 6'5", he's got good speed. I think he's a guy that could be very interesting to see what Georgia is able to get out of him. And so they're going to need, as much as I joke about Tommy Bush and Landers and how often they get brought up, Georgia's probably going to need one of Bush, Landers, Jackson, or Robertson to play well against Virginia and certainly against Alabama to begin the season while, Blaylock obviously coming back from injury and the freshmen sort of get up to speed. Again, Brody brings up we will need them for Bama. That Bama game is going to be very big and very interesting. We've got we'll go another five good minutes here. Connor Riley, 5 minutes, not a BA. 5 minutes that turns into 15 minutes here. Matthew Furlong, good to see you. Good to have you in here. Let's see. Questions, comments. Newman. Let's see. Nathan Edwards, do you think because of this we may look to more of a virtual reality world to give players and quarterbacks real looks? So, there's been stuff written in the past about this virtual reality, options programs. I believe Stanford has looked into doing that. But there's just a difference between doing it in a lab and sort of doing it in a controlled environment, with a headset and a classroom on, and then sort of going out there and adjusting to those guys at real times. With the virtual reality goggles, you can't necessarily get in the full body movements that you have to do to sort of evade rushers and move around in a pocket. And I do think, while teams will explore those, I just, at the end of the day, I don't think there's anything that replaces live reps. And that's why I think this coming season, you're going to see the teams that are going to be best situated to start off this year are just the deeper teams, which in college football just means the elite teams, the best teams out there, Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, Georgia, because not everyone's going to come back in great shape, and that's just a reality I think we all have to live with. Not all of us, and certainly not all the players get the same, sort of workout and have the same sort of workout abilities and situations. So the teams that have more options available, I think, are going to be better off to start the season. Let's see. William Gant Sr. brings up G-Day. Yeah, so today it was announced that Georgia is sort of going to do a virtual G-Day. I believe they're going to re-air the 2019 Georgia-Notre Dame game, one of the better games in recent memories. Certainly from a Sanford Stadium standpoint, I know I had a lot of friends attend that game, really go to Athens that weekend. It was an all-around great weekend for both, I think, the program and sort of what Georgia football has to offer. And Kirby Smart's going to be live tweeting from that. I'll be interested to see how involved Smart is, if he's really giving away, I don't want to say state secrets, but sort of tips or things that the public might not really truly know or have known, or if he's just going to react to plays like a normal fan would. I'm sort of hoping for the former, at least to sort of learn a little bit more about what Georgia football does and Georgia is doing. So we'll sort of see and go from there. Charles Felder, another good question. Who's your dark horse for the season? A person that I think is going to surprise a lot of people. In terms of surprise or performance, this is a good one. Because we all talk about this so much that, there's not really a surprise anymore. Like you could say, guys who think you're going to outperform expectations. We talked about on the Cover 4 Live last week. I mentioned Justin Schaefer as a guy who I think maybe not surprised, but he's going to be a very good player. And it's funny to say dark horse is surprise, but I think a guy like Nakobe Dean really emerging this year. He was a 5-star recruit. He was the number one linebacker in the country. I don't know if that counts as a surprise or a dark horse, but I think he's a guy who I think is going to take a really big step forward. Now you can say, Connor, you've written and said this before, and yeah, I have. And I said it last fall, and he was having, by all accounts, a great fall camp. And then, second Saturday scrimmage, he suffers an ankle injury. And that sort of slowed him down. And now I'm starting to realize that maybe Charles Fuller was asking about a team that emerges as a dark horse. But I'll finish up my point on Nakobe. I think he's another guy who I think would have had a very strong spring. I think he would have sort of taken over that Tate Crowder role, and you have a pairing of Nakobe and Monty Rice. I think that's, other than when Roquan was playing middle linebacker for you, that's probably about as good as Georgia's had it at that spot in a while. And the fact that you can have guys like Quay Walker, Channing Tindall, Nate McBride, Tresman Marshall off the bench as options, I think says a lot about the linebacker depth at Georgia this year. As far as a team that I like perhaps maybe a little bit more than some other than the traditional Ohio States, Clemson, Alabama, Georgia. I think Notre Dame. They bring back Ian Book for another year. They're getting another round of good skill players to come in there. Kyle Hamilton is as good as a player as a good a defensive player as I think you can have. I think Georgia really wishes that they had him as a safety, because to be able in future years to pair him with Lewis Cine, that would have been just an incredible pairing. And their schedule, obviously, they are at the moment they're set to this past year they went to Georgia, and I think they showed that they're a good team. And we'll sort of wrap up this Notre Dame talk because, again, this is Georgia fan. This is Georgia related, but Notre Dame showed that they were able to hang with Georgia, or at least trade blows with them for a while. I don't think the score necessarily indicates that game was ever really in doubt or how much better Georgia was than Notre Dame. But they get Clemson at home this year. That game maybe being at Notre Dame. Obviously, I'm sure they're going to be Clemson fans there, but certainly not to the level that Georgia fans were there in 2017, just given Clemson's is a smaller fan base. I think maybe an 11-1 Notre Dame team with a 1 losses to Clemson, I could certainly see that. They went 10-2 a year ago, and other than a game played against Michigan in the rain, they were a very good team, and I think other than LSU, really as good a team Georgia played on its schedule last year. Zach Smith, he brings up Trayvon Walker. That's another guy. I'm not 100% sure what position he plays all the time on the defensive line, but he's such a good player. There, you just don't see athletes like him. I mean, again, 6'5", 290 pounds. He's on kickoff team, and I've never, I've watched a lot of football, played a decent amount. You just don't see guys that side running down there, busting up kickoffs. And Kirby said, I want to say early November last year, he was one of already Georgia's top 20 players on the team. That's given the fact that he had a broken wrist halfway through the season. So if they get a full healthy season on the wrist, Walker was certainly that. And Scott has shown that he's able to develop players over their time in Athens. If Walker follows that development trend that some of the other guys, a guy like Jordan Davis, who I think made a big leap from his freshman to his sophomore season, if Walker's doing that, man, this Georgia defense, might actually be able to make those sort of plays, those sort of negative havoc plays at a higher rate than they necessarily have these past couple of years. So sort of wrapping things up, we talked about Georgia running backs to open the show and sort of close it with an extended look at G-Day, what we thought we would have seen and whatnot. Final statements, question from you guys. We're going to wrap this up here pretty quickly. Charles Felder, his dark horse, which he was talking about players, so I did read that correctly. He goes with James Cook. Yeah, I don't know, call Cook a dark horse, but he is someone who I've written about, and I'm interested to see what Georgia gets out of him this year, because I do think he's now at a point where he's not, last offseason, he was still sort of playing catch up, trying to get his body up to an SEC level, and he was coming off an offseason ankle surgery. All indications are that he's healthy now. He's ready to go, and sort of, he was already excelling this offseason. Kirby Smart said in sort of the one-on-one matchups, he had the highest win percentage of anyone on the team. So, he's a guy who, again, I think Georgia has to find a role for him and sort of, manufacture plays for him. He's not just a guy who can line back there, hand the ball off, and he'll make stuff happen. I do think you have to get creative with how you use him, and unfortunately that just didn't happen this past season with James Coley. I think teams knew that when he was coming in, he was going to get the ball on a jet sweep, or they were going to try to run a quick screen pass to him, and they were able to key in on that, unfortunately, and that made things tough for him, especially as the year went on. But yeah, so I think James Cook, Kenny McIntosh is another guy you mentioned as a dark horse. So if you ask Mike Griffith, I don't know how dark that horse is. Mike has been pumping up Kenny for quite a while, and he's got, he's from South Florida. He's got 2 brothers that played at Miami, Notre Dame. I believe one of them plays for the Giants now. So he's got, just as good, maybe not quite as good as James Cook, family background with his brother being Dalvin, but he's still got great bloodlines and great connections there in that running back room. So we'll close it out with Brian Kephart's question. What will Kirby tweet during the Notre Dame game replay to make you laugh? That's a good one. So like the stuff that again, I have a twisted sense of humor. Those that know me would certainly say that. During the Sugar Bowl, there was an audio clip of after Warren Erickson got called for a holding late in the game for Georgia, and the audio caught Kirby Smart saying, some stuff that is not suitable for AR, yelling at Warren and stuff like that. And I found that funny. I think so. If I had to target a moment, so thinking back to that Notre Dame game, Eric Stokes goes down early in that game with an injury, and Georgia is essentially playing with DJ Daniel and Tyreek McGee at the cornerback position for most of that game. Tyson Campbell was out with, I believe, a foot injury, turf toe, I believe he had. Brody Mitzel brings up his halftime speech. Certainly that worked given the way Georgia came out and played in the third quarter and the early fourth quarter. But, back to the moment I think I'm going to laugh is, so Stokes goes out with an injury, and Daniel McGee do a pretty good job, all things considered. Notre Dame gets the one touchdown off a muff pump early in the game. But first 3.5 quarters, they really, other than Cole Kmet, which, again, that's not the corner's responsibility or coverage, they sort of figure out how to slow down and stop this Notre Dame offense. And then probably about midway through the fourth quarter, sort of to the end of the fourth quarter, Notre Dame realizes that Georgia doesn't have anybody that can cover Chase Claypool, big wide receiver for them, 6 catches, 83 yards, and a touchdown that drive on McGee. And, Claypool is a guy with the NFL draft coming up next week. That was, he's a guy who, if I were a Falcons fan or if I, as a New England Patriots fan, I certainly hope my team ends up with. Late in that game, so after Claypool gets the touchdown, I imagine Kirby, I hope, Kirby mentioned something about, he's like, well, at that point, I knew Stokes, he said he was healthy. I'm putting him back in there because we cannot lose this because of Swift. So I think that's a good one. Zach Smith, he mentions the DeAndre Swift hurdle. That and J.R. Reed's interception in the Alabama SEC championship game in 2018 are probably the two most impressive athletic feats that I've seen. The Swift one, it's not like he was doing a broad jump or anything. He literally goes straight up and over the Notre Dame defender like he's doing a box jump. And, while he didn't necessarily Swift have those breakaway runs, I think he showed what he's able to do to make defenders miss sort of early on. I think is really why he should be a first-round draft pick. So on that note, we're going to wrap it up. We'll be back later in the week with more videos. You've got Mike Griffith tomorrow for On the Beat, Jeff Santella on Wednesday for Before the Hedges. We're going to do a Cover 4 Live on Thursday, and then obviously you have Brandon Adams every Monday through Friday on DawgNation Daily. This is Connor Riley, and it was good talking to you. Stay safe. Hunker down, shelter in place, keep washing your hands, keep practicing social distancing. Hopefully sooner rather than later, I think we're able to get through this and sort of get back to, talking about players doing stuff on the field. So have a good day. And